Today we have a big treat for you. A First Nations contemporary artist, Kent Monkman, is here from the North, Canada. And now a little background on Mr. Monkman. Kent Monkman is a Canadian artist of Cree ancestry. He's specifically Swampy Cree, or Mushkegowuk. This is meaning the people of the Mushkeg. Ooh, I don't know if I said that right. People of the Mushkeg, Mushkegowuk, something like that. This is northern Manitoba. So he works in a variety of mediums, including painting, moving image, performance, and installation. He's well known for his provocative reinterpretations of romantic North American landscapes. His work explores themes of colonization, sexuality, loss, and resilience, the complexities of historic and contemporary Native American experience. His glamorous diva alter ego, Mischief, appears in much of his work as an agent provocateur, trickster, and supernatural being who reverses the colonial gaze, upending preconceived notions of history and indigenous people. With Mischief at center stage, Monkman has created memorable site-specific performances at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, Compton Verney, and most recently, the Denver Art Museum. His award-winning short film and video works have screened at various festivals nationally and internationally, including the Berlinale and the Toronto International Film Festival. Mr. Monkman has been awarded the Egale Leadership Award, the Indspire Award, and the Hnatyshyn Foundation Visual Arts Award. His work has exhibited internationally and is widely represented in collections of major museums in Canada and the United States. I found a snippet from a recent review of a show that he had last summer at Sergeant's Daughters in New York. That was last June. Craig Vartanian wrote in his review, "Art history commingles with cultural mythology in a passion play about masculinity and belonging. Monkman uses just enough camp to make the works feel self-aware, like the moment in a dream when you realize where you are, wake up, and reflect on the madness." Please welcome Mr. Kent Monkman.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be invited to be a speaker in this series. It's always a great pleasure for me to get out and to meet new people and to share my work. So I want to begin by acknowledging the first people of this territory, the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, who are the original traditional custodians of this territory. My work is in various mediums, so I'm going to try and encapsulate my work as a painter, a filmmaker, and an installation artist and a performer. And often my work kind of, moves back and forth between the different mediums. But I want to give you some insight into how I began as a painter. And any young painter, is kind of saddled with art history. How do you, as a painter, take on the great weight of art history and forge, an original vision? Something that is kind of a little bit intimidating when you're first starting out. So for the first few years as a painter, I kind of worked in an abstract style. I was pushing paint around. I guess I was kind of reluctant to work in a representational manner. I felt like I was, abstract art was sort of the highest form, and then one day I realized that I was kind of failing to communicate some of the themes that were really important to me. And these are themes that have to do with colonization. As a First Nations person, I just felt like I was not communicating my point of view in the world. And so I began this series here, which it was called The Prayer Language. And all of this text that you see layered on the surface of these paintings is the Cree language in a form of Cree syllabics. It's a form of writing in the Cree language. And each painting here is actually a different Christian hymn. So it was the beginning for me to really engage with the experience of colonization, of dealing with the experiences that First Nations people have had in Canadian and you know, in American, or in Canada and the United States with government and church policies. So under each, or under the layers in these paintings are these struggling or grappling figures, and I was, of course, you know, at this point dealing with my own sexuality in my work, and so I had these kind of ambiguous male figures that were based on photographs of men wrestling, and so for me these paintings represented a kind of struggle that was happening, tension, and you know, as I completed this body of work, I felt like I had kind of, you know, accomplished that goal, which was to make an original mark as a painter. And, but at the end of that body of work, I felt kind of unsatisfied because, you know, the themes, these sort of heavier and more important themes that I was, you know, addressing in my work were somehow not meeting the audience. The audience wasn't quite able to penetrate the work. It was a bit too cryptic. Maybe the language, the visual language was too personal. And it was at that point that I realized that I was inheriting a kind of pared down vocabulary of painting, something that had already been pared down by the modernists, by the abstract expressionists, and it really forced that question for myself, is like, why am I, you know, as a First Nations person, working with this, you know, reduced vocabulary of abstract painting, and how is that meaningful, and how is that effective communication? And I realized that I really wanted to communicate these ideas. So what followed was a process of investigation, and so I went back down in scale. These previous paintings are massive, like these are, you know, 7 by 9 foot paintings or something, very elaborate process with, you know, acrylic paint cut with gel medium and transparent layers and moving the paint around with squeegees and so forth. So I went back to a smaller scale, which this is probably about a 5 by 7 inch or 6 by 8 inch painting, watercolor. And I wanted to define who those people were in the painting and also to locate them in some kind of real space. So when I thought about the conflict, you know, this conflict between First Nations people and the Europeans, of course, the first thing that you think about is the land, the place where the, you know, the European settlers and the First Nations people are in contact with each other, and of course in a struggle for land. So that got me thinking immediately about landscape, and as soon as I started thinking about landscape, I realized that I had not really done my homework. I had not really looked at art history to think about landscape painting that was made by the European settlers, and to think about how landscape painting had, you know, affected, or were there images inside this landscape painting tradition that I could look to challenge, to investigate, to research. And so as you can see now, that ambiguous space that these figures were struggling in is now becoming more specific. We see a darker male figure and we see a lighter male figure. So that very quickly led to a cowboy and Indian. And at that point, I realized that I was, you know, using this kind of the iconography of cowboys and Indians to talk about sexuality, but also to talk about this conflict between Europeans and the First People. So in Canada, you know, we have a tradition of landscape painting, as you do in the United States, and this painting is a painting that is part of the group of 7 paintings. And as you can see, the Cree text has now given way to English text. And so what I was doing at this point was looking at pulp Western novels and finding the most kind of like racist and violent passages that I could find and overlaying these over these beautiful kind of landscapes with these homoerotic struggles. So I continued my research, and, you know, this took me into a very fascinating and deep an interesting period of art history in North America, in which there were a number of artists traveling all through North America, making paintings, you know, very romanticized views of North America. So this painting here is called Daniel Boone's First View of the Kentucky Valley. So then I realized, you know, if I'm really going to interact with this art history, that I wanted to kind of take on that challenge of moving towards that those idioms of romantic painting and to aspire to make my paintings look and feel as though they were the real deal. So at that moment, I made my first painting, and this painting is called Daniel Boone's First View of the Kentucky Valley. And as you can see, there's still a layer, there's still that ghosted layer of text, and it was kind of the first painting in that direction of moving towards the romantic painting. But then, you know, at that point I realized that the text was a kind of an artificial kind of construct, an artificial conceit that I was, you know, being the heavy-handed artist, you know, still trying to, you know, put my mark on the painting. And when I realized that, I think it was probably just the kind of the maturing of an artist, is that you realize that your hand is always going to be present in the work, that you don't need to have this sort of, you know, hammer at home. So I decided to let the text go and to kind of disappear my hand into that period of romantic painting and to kind of start messing around with it. So this is a painting by Albert Bierstadt. Now Albert Bierstadt is one of the artists that I often look to and make copies of his paintings, because, you know, he was making these grandiose, romantic, kind of sublime paintings of North America, and essentially Bierstadt's work kind of functioned as almost like a billboard for, you know, the expansion of the West. It was manifest destiny, and, you know, they have a religious quality to them as well. And I thought, wow, you know, here's these religious paintings, and it brought me back to the prayer language paintings. Again, here I found that the Christianity, those ideals were, you know, the ideology was present in this work, and so I felt like I kind of landed somewhere that really fit some of the themes that I was wanting to explore in my work. And of course, Thomas Cole, again, you know, from the Hudson River School, this is the Garden of Eden. So again, with these biblical allegories, I wanted to kind of move forward with my own work, and I made the next painting, and this one's called Sisyphus and Peep. Now, when I looked more deeply into that period of art history, I also discovered that there were these paintings made by European settlers at that time, which were called captivity narratives, and they were really to, you know, instill fear in the settler population about Native Americans. So, you know, Native American men as aggressive rapists. Here's another one. This is Daniel Boone's daughter. Another abduction of Daniel Boone's daughter, again, very sexualized. So I did my version, and this is the abduction of Daniel Boone Jr. He's sort of a Huck Finn character. So it's kind of his moment of liberation, in fact. So this is a painting by John Mix Stanley, and as I got to know the art of this period more, I started to look at individual artists more closely too, and I noticed here John Mix Stanley was, you know, painting himself into the work, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. They're kind of, you know, they saw themselves, you know, they were artists, but they saw themselves as these kind of macho explorer guys. And George Catlin is another artist that I've looked quite closely at over the years, and here he is making a painting of himself, making a painting of a chief. And, you know, he wrote about it in his journals, how, you know, he was revered by these different people because he could make these images. And so it got me thinking about how can I, you know, create an artistic persona that can then live in my work and be that artistic persona, the person with the power, the person that has the gaze. And I wanted to reverse the gaze and create a character that could look back at Europeans. And so I thought about two-spirit people, the Bierstadt. This is a Zuni person named Wewa, who all the two-spirit people of North America that existed and still exist in all of our nations, who were revered. Now, when Europeans came, they didn't have a way of understanding this. They didn't understand that there could be a third gender, that men could live in a female role, that women could live in a male role. So I wanted to make sure that that was front and center in my work because of my interest in colonized sexuality and the fact that these practices were kind of, you know, repressed. So I created Mischief, and Mischief Eagle testicle. So her name itself is a play on mischief, and the ego of the artist, the egotism, egotistical. And so here she is making an image, and of course, for her outfit, I looked to Cher. Now, Cher was interesting to me because not only was she culturally cross-dressing, she was gender cross-dressing. But before Cher, there was Molly Spotted Elk, and Molly Spotted Elk was a Penobscot woman that actually performed in Paris in the early 1900s in these review shows. So these were the inspirations for Mischief in her outfit. And this is one of the first paintings where I brought her to life in my work as this kind of powerful artist persona. So not long after, I realized that it was time to bring Mischief to life as a real performance character, because when I looked at performance culture, at first, like the Aboriginal performance culture, there were First Nations people performing for Europeans for many, many years already. Beginning with the Wild West shows, George Catlin took his gallery to Europe, and there were a group of Ojibwe people that toured with him and traveled with him. So I started to create this backstory for Mischief, that she was this performer in George Catlin's touring exhibition. And so here she has her subjects, these European males that she dressed up to look more European. Now, the artists of that time, George Catlin, Paul Kane, a number of others, were really obsessed with this idea that Native American people, if they didn't exist in their original state, they didn't exist at all. They saw any kind of influence from European cultures as contamination. So they really were set on this idea that the romantic savage was had to be frozen in time. And George Catlin wrote much about that, and a lot of his paintings were very much about trying to be this faithful documentarian about all the first people that he came in contact with. So I did a number of performances, and this is one that I did in England, and Mischief goes out. This is the backstory, is that she's gone out and she's left George Catlin, and now she's running her own show, and she's looking for male models, and she happens along Robin Hood and Friar Tuck. So this is an image of one of the troops that toured with Catlin in Europe. So I wanted to create, a number of works in different media that, again, we're kind of building Mischief's mythology and talking about performance culture. So I created this series of photographs in which I imagined her kind of like this character that was touring Europe at that time. And here she is as this kind of vaudeville character, a sharpshooter in the Wild West shows, as an early silent film star, and then finally emerging as a film director herself. So I made a number of different media pieces, and some of them were kind of shot in this old-timey kind of black and white style. So this is another painting, I believe, by Thomas Cole, in which, again, it kind of reinforces the Christian ideology. This is Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. So what I've done over the past few years is I've taken Mischief and kind of more or less rampaged through art history, and here she is kind of seducing a Canadian Mountie in this sort of idyllic setting. She's seducing him with the forbidden fruit, trying to lure him into her canoe, which is stacked with Louis Vuitton luggage. Louis Vuitton is her favorite brand. This is a series, a trilogy of 3 paintings, and there's a narrative that passes through in which Mischief kind of, falls in love, and they're like the star-crossed lovers. This is based on a painting at the Met, the Storm. And this character that she's in love with is this guy named Thomas Scott, and Thomas Scott was a kind of the thorn in the side of Louis Riel, who was the leader of the Métis people in Manitoba when he was trying to form a Republic of Manitoba. So it ends with the execution scene, and of course Mischief is upstaging that as well. And here's the scene at the grave, and of course, there's nothing more beautiful than romantic grief. So again, here she is kind of grieving at the grave of her dead lover. And some of you might recognize the image, the iconic image of the forlorn Indian on the horse. And of course, that comes back to this James Earl Frazer piece, which again reinforces this idea that Native people were dying, vanishing, disappearing. So I've used that in a number of pieces, this being another one, based on this painting here by Jerome Pygmalion in Galate, in which the artist creates this sculpture that's so realistic that he falls in love with it. So again, it comes back to this idea of those artists kind of creating these images, creating this illusion of Native people that they were so infatuated with Native people as being dead. This is another painting of that period. Again, it's sort of like this iconic image of the almost like the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus. Surveying the land, the empty land that was theirs for the taking. So I created my version, which Mischief is playing the role of Venus, and Custer is Mars, and we have a little Cupid there, and Custer is trying to shoot the coyote. And then this is another painting by Miller, Alfred Jacob Miller, in which, again, had to deal with sexuality. So, Native women were often married to trappers, so I wanted Mischief to be married to a trapper. So I created a character here where she's the trapper's bride. And so on it goes. Here she is in this scene with trappers and explorers kind of, appearing as this apparition on the lake. There's Edward Curtis, renowned photographer, romantic photographer, posing his models on the left side of the painting. And there's Pollock and Mondrian, both having epiphanies. This painting is kind of about artistic epiphanies. Mondrian's early work, of course, was landscape-based. And then Pollock, as you can see, is having his epiphany as the paint flies off of Mondrian's brush and lands on the canvas. And Pollock's, early work was influenced by native pictographs and sand painting. So the man with the winter count, the hide there's 100 years of Lakota history on that painted on that hide. So my work has very much been about challenging history and how history can be told different ways, how history folds different ways, and all depends on the teller. Lewis and Clark, some hot trappers. So this is a painting by George Catlin. Now, George Catlin has been, one curator called him my nemesis, and I think that could be true, but he's a man of contradictions, and I think I've been interested in his work for that reason. But here's a painting that is called Dance to the Bierstadt. It was an honor dance in the Sac and Fox tribes to the male who lived as the female in that tribe. And so Catlin made a painting. Thankfully, he actually made a painting about it, and he talked about it in his journal. But the other thing that he said in his journal was that it was one of the most disgusting things he'd ever seen, and how he wished for it to be this ritual to be extinguished forever. So for me, that was, that really spoke to the contradiction of this artist who, on one hand, purports to be this faithful documentarian of, the First Nations, and then at the same time, he's kind of, when he encounters something that doesn't kind of suit him or please him, he sort of wants it to be extinguished. So I've made a number of works kind of in response to that painting, because that painting to me was such a powerful, had so much meaning and layers in it. This is a painting that is kind of a response painting in which it's kind of reviving that honor dance, in which Mischief is now being danced to as that Bierstadt, and there's this swirling dance happening around her with a number of different men, but in a way it's a kind of a collision of the different mythologies too, European mythologies and Native American mythologies. And it was inspired in part by this painting here by I'm blanking. This called The Triumph of Christianity Over Paganism. So it was this idea that Christianity was triumphing over paganism. So there's Lewis and Clark here on the left being mauled by a grizzly bear. There's a story about how many grizzly bears that they encountered when they were traveling through Missouri, and there was a Native American scholar, Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote an essay about that, and he talked about that it wasn't by chance that they encountered all these bears, that the bears were called upon to help move these people out of their territory. And there's the center of the scene, oops, sorry, and then Picasso is kind of entering in this scene too, and so it was probably at this moment that I realized that I had to kind of like start talking about modernism too, because the modernists were really looking at indigenous cultures, at oceanic cultures for influence for their work, and we'll get to that in a bit. So on the far right of the painting, there's Catlin himself, who's kind of obsessed with his image, and one of his subjects, this gentleman named Pigeon's Egg, and this is the painting that Catlin made of him, and it was kind of a moral lesson in his mind. It was like, this is the pure Indian in his natural state, and here he is, with all this influence. This guy actually went to Washington and came back to his tribe, and he had a top hat, and of course he had elements of his own culture, but Catlin really used this as a kind of moral lesson in the before and after. But it was fine for Catlin to cross-dress, and here he is wearing, a buckskin outfit that he got somewhere. So in one of the Mandan villages where Catlin was painting, he basically had entry into some of these societies because he was making these portraits, which kind of, really impressed the people. And so, but he wasn't allowed to make paintings of just anybody. It was really the high-ranking people in the society, the chiefs, the warriors. And one day he talks about in this journal how there were these fabulous-looking guys that he called dandies, faint-hearts, he said they were referred to in their own community, but they had the most exquisite outfits. They didn't have the trophies from, they didn't have bear claws, they didn't have scalp locks. They were making these incredible outfits out of, animals that they could easily catch, rabbits and squirrels and things, but they looked fantastic. So I wanted to kind of devote a series to these dandies, because he went to make paintings of these guys, and the chiefs and the warriors said, no, you can't paint those guys. They don't have rank in our society that we have. So Catlin went so far as to make a chalk outline of one of these characters, and he erased it, and that painting never got made. So for me, these dandies kind of stand in for, narratives that were never authorized, never painted by Catlin or by anybody else. So it got me thinking about these colorful characters, these dandies that lived in these societies. So in the background of these Catlin portraits, I've chalked in these dandies as I imagined them, and I also imagined them as being the fashion-forward gentlemen of the tribe. So in my paintings, a lot of the dandies have parasols, and Catlin, for one, would never put a parasol in. He would never have a native person holding a parasol, because that was a European trade item, and for him, in his mind, that's contamination. So my dandies, as you can see, this is a drawing made by some Kiowa men who were incarcerated during the Indian Wars, and of course you can see that everyone there had a parasol. So a lot of my dandies had parasols and top hats and high heels, and I was thinking about, kind of really exquisite, almost like show-like outfits. So it was kind of fun to design the costumes. And then I started populating the landscapes with these characters. Landscapes that were painted empty. Like this is Moran. This is a landscape by Moran that was empty, and then I put the painter in there, and I also put the dandies in there who were kind of vying for the attention of the artist but not getting noticed. You can see that his painting is empty. And here you have Curtis, again, staging one of his photographs while the dandies are being ignored. And here they are. I thought they looked kind of like wildflowers in this painting. So because I ended up making a number of media pieces, I had an opportunity to exhibit my work across the country, and I wanted to create a theater space that would feel like it was Mischief's theater. And so I made a full-size teepee out of velvet, and this is the first time it was exhibited in Toronto. But when you went inside the teepee, there was a chandelier, and inside the chandelier, a movie projector. And so you could go inside the teepee and watch the movies being projected on the floor. And in some of the galleries that I exhibited the work, they didn't have ceiling heights high enough, so I had to kind of create a teepee-like space. So I decided to make it out of beads and string. And when you were in that teepee space, you were also able to see the painting, so it was a kind of an immersive environment that allowed you to interact with numerous works in the exhibition. And here is a velvet teepee that was designed to fit into a lower ceiling height. This is one of the films that's a 2-channel version, and again I was thinking about he's kind of giving a presence of mischief, but with these kind of elements of her personal items. So again, back to this painting by Catlin, and I thought I wanted to make a video piece that kind of recreated this dance, and so I created a piece called Dance to the Bierstadt. It's a 5-channel piece in which Mischief is danced to in this honor dance. And so I starved myself and got really lean and worked with a really good fashion designer and an amazing choreographer. And I found some very talented native dancers who functioned as my dandies. And I designed these outfits, again with the parasol and the top hats. And then the piece can be experienced in this kind of immersive environment where you can actually walk around these hides. And so the film is projected in these rear screen projections on 5 hides, Mischief being in the center. And there's a very dynamic score which was taken from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. So again, I was thinking about European primitivism, this idea, the kind of reduction of First Nations cultures through the eye of the European. And it was kind of this amazing mashup of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, and we used, I had a powwow singer and electronic music, and it has a really dynamic score. Okay, so one of the idioms that I've worked with has been the museum diorama. They're slightly out of order here. This is a diorama, a natural history diorama from the Museum of Manitoba Museum, where I grew up. So when I was a kid, I would go down to the museum on school trips, and I would see, my own culture kind of represented in the museum, kind of frozen in time. I would step outside the museum, and it was kind of like the worst of Skid Row. There were my people outside who had been, gone through colonization, and to me, there was this discrepancy between what was happening in the museum and what was happening to my own people on the streets. And that was something that affected me profoundly as a kid, because it took me almost a lifetime to get to that point where I could articulate it. And so I decided to work with this idiom of the museum diorama, and I had an opportunity in a group exhibition in Winnipeg to make my first diorama. So I'm just going to backtrack 2 slides because I got out of order. Oops. Here it is. Now, instead of doing, setting, a First Nations person in a natural environment like they did in the museum, I wanted to, in this case, put Mischief in a quote-unquote civilized environment. So again, I was thinking about Mischief and her mythology being in Europe, having toured with George Catlin, and then leaving his troupe and kind of going off on her own. But one of the themes of this exhibition was, because it was all First Nations people and First Nations curators, it was about imagining ourselves in the future. So because Mischief was, kind of youngish, I decided to age her up into her old age, and I imagined her as this kind of aging diva alone in her Paris apartment, kind of like Maria Callas when, her career was over. She would sort of holed up in her apartment in Paris, and she would listen to her own records. So in this case, Mischief is alone in her apartment listening to her one hit, Dance to Mischief. And here in this space, there's, You know, there's animals, and we don't know, are these animals from her imagination? Are they her pets? The beaver's like chewing on the record player. There's a record that's spinning around. And you see that she has a view through the window. And that view is one of my landscape paintings. But as you walk around the installation, you get a better view of the painting. And in the painting, it's the young Mischief, the young pretty Mischief on her pony, surrounded by the bison. So it was a way of tying in my piece to the bison diorama at the Manitoba Museum. And then the window, the view back into the space was a crying, very sad Mischief with her mascara running. And Mischief cries a lot in my work. And this sculpture was fitted with a water pump, so she cries real tears every minute. This is another piece that is kind of in that dioramic idiom, in which I used Mischief, again, in this kind of biblical allegory to talk about memory and how the story of Lot and his wife, you know, how they were expelled. God expelled them from Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were not supposed to look back. They were not supposed to, you know, look back and reflect on where they had come from. And so I wanted to use this as an allegory to talk about the forced removal of my great-grandmother from our traditional territory. In fact, she was moved 3 times before she finally relocated on a non-reserved land. So the video back, the panoramic backdrop there is a high-definition video of the place where she was born, which the government, you know, reclaimed. And so I created this pillar of salt as Lot's wife, you know, who was turned into a pillar of salt. Mischief was punished for having a memory, for looking back. So that's one of the themes that it's reemerged in my work in recent years, is this idea of deliberate amnesia. And then when I thought about it, I realized that this period of modernity has probably been the most vicious in terms of that intention for us to forget the past, to move away from the past. And European modernism was very much, you know, intentional. There were horrific things that were happening in Europe, and people wanted to forget it. But, you know, for First Nations people to be on the receiving end of that kind of deliberate amnesia, it's been very painful and obviously very devastating to have culture and languages lost. So, again, in keeping with the diorama, I was interested in, you know, Germans have this fascination with Native American people. And they have a buddy couple like Tonto and the Lone Ranger. The Karl May wrote about Winnetou and Shatterhand. So I've been exploring the German fascination. In this case, I wanted these 2 buddy couples to be in their domestic environments, and both of them kind of tragic love stories. So on one side we have Apollo and Hyacinth, the male warrior love couple. One of them dies, and Achilles and Patroclus. And again, I was thinking about that view through the window. So this is another thing that has occurred in my work a number of times, is that view through the window. And I think I've been thinking about that because I've been thinking about the illusion of space, the flattening of space and the illusion of space. And so because this installation had to be in 3 different countries at the same time, I couldn't have, you know, 6 paintings in these 2 sets of windows. I had to come up with a way of doing it. So we ended up making this video in which I wore all 4 costumes, and we shot me in green screen and inserted it digitally into this landscape that I painted and then shot on film. So it was kind of a complicated piece, but it ended up having this really interesting effect. Now you're probably wondering, I forgot to mention, but every head in all of these dioramas is a cast of my head. I had been to the Museum of Natural History in New York, and there they basically standardized everyone in North America with the same male face, whether it was a female or a male, regardless of what nation or gender or age or anything, it was the same face. So I decided that all of my installations are going to have my head on them. So this is a recent piece, again exploring, you know, the idiom of the diorama. It's called Bête Noire, and you know, I've been thinking about, you know, the modernist flattening of pictorial space, and so here Mischief has just taken out one of Picasso's bulls. you know, flattened. And this is life size. Like this is, the backdrop is about 28 feet long, so it's quite immersive. It was the first time I did something at that scale. This is another very large-scale installation that I did at the Toronto Art Fair, and I wanted to do a large piece for that event because I wanted to explore the diorama even further, but in this case I wanted it to feel almost like a carnival show. For any of you artists or anyone who's been to an art fair, it's kind of a strange place for artists because it's so closely tied to commerce, and you know, it's kind of fraught in many ways for artists. But so I wanted to create this almost like a fun house where you would walk through and find these different rooms. And so I kind of reduced the art world to 4 major players. The collector, so this is the collector's room. He's a raven. So I had a number of performers sit in these rooms throughout the art fair. And again, the view into the window in the back, one of my paintings. This is the smartest curator in the world. It was actually, we did this kind of trick with mirrors. It just looked like a head on a table. It kind of freaked people out a little bit. This was the dealer, the kind of the two-faced art dealer. And these were the paintings that were on view in those windows. So this was kind of the first sort of real intervention of these modernist flattened figurations inside these sort of illusions, three-dimensional illusions, or illusions of three-dimensional space. And you know, I was thinking about how modernism kind of flattened pictorial space, and for me that's been this allegory of how you know, First Nations cultures kind of got reduced through colonization and through this period of modernity. So by juxtaposing these flat characters into these scenes of, these romantic scenes and these illusions of three-dimensional space, it has a kind of jarring effect. So in this case, Mischief is kind of like Princess Diana. She's wearing Princess Diana's outfit. She's kind of like a caregiver who's kind of, you know, braiding the hair of this, one of Picasso's women from Les Demoiselles, which was known for its kind of brutal depiction of women. A Matisse. This is a painting. Mischief is kind of lecturing to these characters. It's called Teaching the Lost. So this brings me pretty much to the current body of work, which I've called the Casualties of Modernity, in which these modernist figurations are kind of, you know, in these scenes with First Nations people in urban environments. I kind of moved away from the landscapes and you know, shot all these photographs in Winnipeg, my hometown, which has a very high Native population, and you know, cast a lot of these modernist figurations, mostly of the female nude, to talk about the kind of violence against the female spirit, violence against women, but violence against the female spirit. And I feel like those paintings that were made by, you know, Cubists and others there's a kind of inherent violence in the way they're painted. So here's a hunting scene where Mischief is kind of taking out, again, she's taking out one of the Picasso bulls. She's culling the herd. So this brings me to one of my most recent works, and I'm going to show you the video that plays in this. But again, I created a performance at the Denver Art Museum. I'll show you some images of that, in which Mischief is kind of like this philanthropist, like Diana, who would go to hospitals and she would touch the sick and the dying, and you know, she was the first to hug AIDS patients. And you know, I created this parallel between Mischief and Princess Diana because I feel like they both had this kind of contentious relationship with the crown. So here Mischief is as the celebrity nurse in this hospital room, and this was actually a piece commissioned by Bank of Montreal in Toronto. So this is on the 68th floor of their tower, on the floor of their boardroom level, and the patient is lying in bed. This female nude by Picasso, and there's a soap opera. So I decided to have Mischief visit the modern wing and interact with these different art pieces. And so I decided to version the piece as a soap opera. So this was the performance in Denver in which Mischief arrives at the modern wing of the institution. She's introduced by the chief curator, and she's led on a tour by the Doctor of Fine Arts. And she's led, different gurneys are rolled out, and she interacts with them. So that's the final image in the slideshow. So I'm going to show you, this is the most recent video piece. Oops. And that will, and then of course I'll be back for questions after.
I know that I can give love for a minute.
Mischief!
For half an hour, for a day, for a month. I can give.
Please follow me, Mischief. Lots of work to do.
Oh. I'm very happy to do that, and I want to do that.